Hello and welcome to another historical knitting video and a little bit of sewing. I wanted to wish everyone a very belated Happy New Year and happy holiday season. I know it's almost a month since everything has gone by, but I just love how warm that time of year feels. I love all the candles, all the incense, so I just try to keep that cozy feeling going for as long as I can. As many of you know, I'm continuing to work on making the early 1890s outfit by hand. So far I've completed my stockings, the combinations, trimming my corset, the underskirt, the bustle pad, a petticoat, and now I am making a corset cover, which is actually recommended by a lot of you guys. So thank you so much for all the feedback. I always appreciate all the feedback that I get from you all. The pattern for this corset cover I got from Truly Victorian again, which is the same place that I got the pattern for the petticoat. And while the Truly Victorian corset cover pattern doesn't necessarily include the time frame that I was looking at, the research that I was doing actually showed that one of the options was pretty close to a lot of the corset covers around in the early 1890s. So for example, you can see here in a fashion magazine, there's one particular one that looks actually very close to the Truly Victorian sewing pattern. And I found a few pieces from museum collections that also look very, very close. So my idea is that I'll be sewing the corset cover pattern and then using a knit lace trim to trim around the neckline and the armholes. I'm always excited to choose a new lace trim because I have so many options in my The Art of Knitting book, which I have from 1892, and which is what I'm trying to knit most of these items from. If you're also interested in knitting some of these yourself, The Art of Knitting is available online for free. Please feel free to check that out yourself, and I'll put a link in the description down below. However, I have found when I was knitting a lot of these lace trims and insertions up myself that there's some errors. It's written in a very old style, and not a lot of the markings or annotations are consistent across lace patterns. So what I have done is I've translated them myself into modern knitting terms, and I've actually charted them up. I have one available for free, so you can kind of see what my lace charts look like. See if you're interested in them. That's the one that I used to trim the bottom of my bustle pad. And then the other four, so the lace that I used to trim the bottom of my petticoat and put the insertion lace at the bottom of the petticoat, as well as to trim my corset, and now to trim my corset cover, I've all included a link below where you can purchase that yourself. Once again, you can also get them for free, but I will tell you that there are some mistakes that I found that I interpreted and corrected in the way that I could. I also charted it up, and I tried to include some pictures for some steps that I thought were a little bit extra confusing when I was going through and knitting these lace charts myself. Okay, so let's get started.
The Truly Victorian pattern that I chose is one that you can print out yourself, which I did, and then you tape all the different pieces together before actually cutting out the pieces that you need. As I did with the petticoat pattern, I outlined exactly where I would be cutting because I tend to kind of zone out while I'm cutting and I want to make sure that I cut along the right lines. And I'm actually also making a mock-up for this corset cover. I thought that making a mock-up would be pretty important because there's actually a lot of customization mentioned in the pattern itself, which is really cool, but also I thought would require me actually trying on the piece to see if the customizations that I had already done and will be doing would make sense. The other thing that's mentioned in this pattern is that you can either use flat fell seams or French seams. Now, to be honest, I had never done either of these before, so I actually really appreciated the fact that while making the mock-up, I could try out both of them to see which one I liked better. Either the flat fell seam, which you can see that I'm doing here, or a French seam. Now I'm directly able to compare what a flat fell seam, which is on the left here, looks like versus a French seam, and I think the flat fell seam actually looks quite nice. I just worry about my ability to actually do nice even stitches on the flat fell seam, and the ironing of that seam is also quite tough, so I decided to go with French seams. Here is my absolute first fitting of the mock-up, and as you can see, the shape is kind of there, but there are definitely some problems. So the front is gaping quite a bit, so I'm going to have to add a little bit of width there, as well as the waist being far too high. So my waist is way further down, like another inch or 2 inches maybe. So I really have to bring the waist down from the mock-up. Here it is after some alterations. Something else I didn't mention before is that the arm side or the armhole was also not large enough, so I cut that back as well. I added like a good 2 inches to the length and then also increased the size at the middle in order to accommodate for my waist. When it was time to finally cut out the final pattern, I actually changed the pattern pieces themselves to reflect the alterations I had made to my mock-up before cutting it out. Then it was time for quite a bit of sewing, a lot of French seams, some mistakes, but overall I am actually quite proud with how all these seams turned out. And while French seams do take some extra time, I think the clean finished look and how protected your seams are is well worth it. I tried to be as careful as I could when I was doing these French seams in order to make sure that I had them on the right side so that the seam was actually on the wrong side of the fabric, but of course I managed to mess one up, so here you can see that I'm undoing it. In the end it didn't turn out quite as pretty as the other seams, but here is the finished corset cover base. So I've pinned it together in the front. You can see after my fitting, it does fit me a bit better than before. I think there's definitely room for improvement for this corset cover. However, for this being my first ever custom fitted piece of clothing, I'm actually quite proud of how it turned out. What you'll see here is that there's some extra gaping at the back of the neck that I never really took care of, which really stands out to me now. However, you know, there's always going to be areas that I can improve, and looking at it from the point of view of this being my first actually custom fitted piece of clothing, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Now it's on to knit the lace trim that's going to go around the neckline and in the arm openings. This time I decided to use a much smaller or thinner thread. I used crochet thread in size 10. I don't know if that means much to anyone. It didn't really to me. I was just trying to find the absolute smallest thread available. Here you can see that I've completed the first repeat of the lace pattern, and I'm actually really pleased with how it looks, especially when you stretch it out and you can kind of see that diamond shape coming out. So I'm really happy with the lace pattern that I chose, and I can't wait to see how it works up even more. One thing that's happening when I'm working with these small metal needles is that my ring finger on my right side is really getting irritated. You can see how it's red and I got that bump forming. I decided for where I was at the moment, which is at the public library, I would just use my hat as kind of a cushion to buffer the pressure that I was feeling against my finger, but I'm going to figure out a different way to handle this in the future. Those small metal needles really put some extra pressure on my fingers when I was knitting. In order to address that problem, I actually decided to take a small sampler of the lace that I had knit and form it into a tube, add some elastic to kind of create like a knitting thimble almost. I don't really know what to call it, but it's kind of a protective layer that goes over the spot where I usually feel the most pressure on my ring finger, and it worked out quite well. After putting this on my finger, it's not so tight, but it's not so loose that it slips off, but it's not so tight it cuts off circulation, but it adds just the right amount of cushioning so that I don't get that irritated feeling and have to stop knitting early. After getting a good, I would say maybe 10 to 15 repeats in of the lace, I decided to check it against the corset cover base that I have. I really like how it looks. I like the width of it a lot. It is a little bit wider than I was hoping that it would be, but I think it'll still complement the corset cover quite nicely. And it fits really well both in the arm opening as well as along the neckline. I just wanted to do a bit of a test fitting to see how much more I would have to knit to both go all the way around the armhole and all the way around the neckline, while trying to also kind of estimate how much it would stretch when I was blocking it out. And here we are. So I have completed the lace. This is the lace for the neckline, and I've also completed the 2 pieces of lace for each armhole. There was quite a lot of lace repeats needed just because the yarn size and the needle size was so small, but I really like how the end effect is and how delicate the lace looks. So you can see I did 3 separate sections, one for the right arm, one for the left armhole, and then one around the neckline. I did keep the lace on the needle for this part just to be 100% sure that I would have enough length to go around the neck. I wasn't willing to cast off without fully knowing that I would be able to reach all the way around the neckline. So I've actually, while I was blocking it, I kept it on the needle with live stitches just in case I needed to knit a little bit more. Before adding the trimming to the lace, I decided to starch it, and I got the recipe or the idea of how to starch it from one of my Instagram followers. Her name is Laura Bush. I'll put it up on the screen. I'm so sorry. I probably absolutely butchered your name, but thank you so much. She told me to put some cornstarch in water and then boil it. And after it's boiled, to soak the lace in it, pin it out, and then press it with a cloth in between to prevent yellowing. I will say I used probably way more starch than I should have. So you can see here I'm watering it down. I watered it down quite a bit. You probably only needed a few spoonfuls for this much water. But in the end, I think the mixture turned out quite well, and I soaked all of the lace in it, each section separately, and then I pinned it out. I tried to measure out the length of the lace that it would have to be to wrap all the way around each armhole and the neckline, and I marked it out on my blocking mats while I was pinning down my lace. I also tried to make sure that the bottom edge of the lace was very straight because I knew that that would probably help me when I was stitching it on. So I was trying to add as many pins as I could to keep a nice straight line on the bottom edge. I could sew on the lace as easily as possible to my corset cover. After starching, the lace looks fantastic. I was worried it would be a little bit too stiff, but I actually really like the structure that the starch gives to the lace and how sturdy it feels. So I feel like it'll really last for quite some time. I know that I can't really wash it unless I want to restarch the lace once I've trimmed my corset cover with this, but I really like like I said, the sturdiness that I feel from putting the starch on the lace. And then as my Instagram follower recommended, she said to press it with a cloth in between, and I really think that this kind of added that nice final touch of stiffness and straightness to my lace. I also kept this clip in here just to prove to you guys that I really did try to iron this corset cover. I had to wash it, and then I tried to iron it as best as I could, but it was just so wrinkly. If you guys have any suggestions on how I can better iron out the cotton corset cover, please let me know, because I have it on the highest heat setting and I think I ironed it like 3 or 4 times and it's still wrinkly, as you can see from the footage. Here I'm also testing out the length of the lace. Like I said before, I had originally kept the stitches live, but after blocking it out it does reach all the way around the neckline. So I'm pretty happy. I cast off those stitches and I've pinned everything in place and it's ready to sew on with another new sewing technique that I've never done before called the heirloom insertion method. And then these are the buttons I've chosen. So they're a little bit shiny, kind of remind me of mother of pearl, and I'm really excited to do the finishing touches. So here you can see me doing the heirloom insertion lace method. Is that sewing method? I don't really know the full name of what it's called, I'm sorry, but I was holding my breath through the entire time that I was doing this. I really wanted to make sure that on my first try that it went well, or at least well enough to end up not having to redo it, because I wasn't sure that my lace would survive being unpicked and re-sewn on if that was needed. I think it turned out okay. There's definitely a few spots where I could have done a little bit better, but overall I think the final effect is basically what I've been going for, and it seems sturdy enough that the lace trim will actually stay on my sewing. After finishing attaching the lace trim to the neckline as well as each armhole, I did the finishing touches that were necessary. The first of all is at the bottom of each armhole. I had to sew together the lace trim, so I did that on each side. Now comes the scariest bit of finishing touches, is trimming the folded over part where I sewed on the lace to the corset cover and trimming it as close as possible. I was just absolutely paranoid that I was going to completely cut through the main fabric. Luckily I didn't. The other thing that you can see that I'm doing here is the part at the neckline where there's a sharp bend. I am sewing together that lace. I probably way overdid it, but I was really paranoid that once I snipped this off, you see here, there's the corner that was kind of bunching up and causing the lace to not lay very flat. And then I cut it off. And this moment, I think I had to cut out like 5 minutes of me contemplating exactly if I was really going to cut this off. But I did it and it didn't fall apart. And here's the little cut off lace bit that probably, I think, made me feel sick to my stomach there. I definitely didn't need to sew quite as much to keep the lace nice and sturdy, but you can see that it's going to hold even if I have a little bit of extra bulk from the seam. I just wanted to make sure that the lace wasn't going to unravel. That was a lot of work. I then did the same thing at the other corner of the corset cover, and here are the 2 bits of lace that I ended up cutting off, which is so hard to see, but also interesting that they basically match. Something I decided not to show because I was getting a bit frustrated was the attaching of the buttons and sewing of the buttonholes. That's another piece that had me so nervous. Always snipping into the final fabric makes me really nervous, but I think it turned out okay. After all of that work, here is my completed corset cover. I definitely, once again, as always, see a lot of room for improvement, especially in the stark daylight where you can see the significant difference in color with the thread that I used to the fabric to the actual yarn that I used for the lace trim. I wish I could have matched all of that a little bit better, but I am pleased overall with the effect of what this corset cover looks like, especially with the knit lace trim. I also really love how the silhouette looks, and thank you guys so much for the suggestion that you gave me to actually make this corset cover, because I wasn't originally planning on it, but then you guys suggested it that I really should, and I completely agree. I think it smooths out all of the lines of all the other underlayers underneath that I'm wearing, from the corset to the bustle pad ties and all the ties in the back. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate all of the input. The other thing that's really exciting about this is I am now done with all of the underlayers I had been planning on making. So actually now it's time for me to sew all of the pieces that go on top of it, like the blouse and the jacket and the skirt. So it'll really be a lot less knitting in the next few videos. It'll be more sewing. Actually, you guys can let me know if you would prefer me to make one video per piece that I'll be sewing, like one for the skirt, one for the blouse, one for the jacket, or if you'd like me to wait a little bit longer and just release it as one, so it'll just be one sewing video versus a bunch of them before I get back to some more historical knitting. In any case, thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like. If you want to see more of my historical knitting and some sewing, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you guys again next time.